The letter arrived in Ottawa with unusual speed. Not a letter in the diplomatic sense, a formal communiqué routed through Beijing's embassy on Sussex Drive, carrying specific language about market access that Chinese officials had refused to put in writing with Washington for the better part of a decade. The offer on the table was not comprehensive trade normalization. It was something narrower and in some ways more consequential. A structured pathway for Canadian critical minerals, Canadian agricultural commodities, and Canadian energy to enter Chinese markets under terms that the United States, Canada's largest trading partner, its closest military ally, the country it shares 4,000 kilometers of border with, had been categorically denied. Mark Carney looked at it, and he accepted. That decision, made in the spring of 2025 by a prime minister who had spent most of his career in the architecture of global finance rather than the theater of geopolitics, has since become one of the most debated moves in Canadian foreign policy in a generation. What exactly did China offer? Why did Beijing extend it to Ottawa and not Washington? What does Carney's acceptance mean for the continental relationship that has defined Canadian prosperity since 1988? And here's the question I will return to later in this script, because the answer is not what most of the surface coverage has suggested. What does this moment tell us about the durability of the Western alliance system itself? That is the question underneath this story, and it is worth spending serious time on. Mark Carney came to the prime ministership in early 2025 carrying credentials that were unusual for a Canadian political leader. Governor of the Bank of Canada, then Governor of the Bank of England, then a senior advisory role at Brookings on global financial architecture. He had spent his professional life thinking about systemic risk, about how large economic structures break, and about what it costs when they do. He was not a man inclined to theatrical gestures. When he moved toward Beijing, the people who know him best said he was not making a political statement. He was making a calculation. The calculation rested on a specific vulnerability. Canada produces approximately 60% of the world's known reserves of several critical minerals: lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements that are essential to electric vehicle manufacturing, defense electronics, and the energy transition. Under the previous trading architecture, the overwhelming majority of Canada's export pathway for those minerals ran through or depended upon American industrial demand. When the Trump administration began signaling in late 2024 that it might reclassify certain Canadian mineral exports under national security review provisions, a move that would have subjected them to the same friction as Chinese imports, Ottawa recognized that the continental dependency into 37 years had become a structural liability. Beijing noticed, and Beijing moved. What China offered Canada in the spring of 2025 is worth reconstructing with precision, because the coverage has been imprecise. This was not a comprehensive free trade agreement. China has not offered that to any Western country. What Beijing put forward was a sectoral access framework covering 3 specific categories: critical minerals and battery-grade processed materials, canola and pulse agricultural exports, and liquefied natural gas from British Columbia's coast. For each category, Chinese negotiators offered reduced tariff schedules, expedited customs processing, and, crucially, guaranteed annual volume floors that would give Canadian exporters planning certainty across a 5-year horizon. The volume floors are the detail most coverage underplayed. A floor is not a ceiling. It is a commitment to buy a minimum quantity regardless of price fluctuations, market softness, or bilateral political temperature. for a Canadian mining company deciding whether to capitalize a new lithium project in the Northwest Territories, a Chinese volume floor is the difference between a financeable project and a stranded asset. The offer was, in the language of someone who spent a career at Goldman Sachs and the Bank of England, bankable. The United States has not been offered volume floors. It has been offered the opposite. Chinese retaliatory tariff schedules that have made American agricultural exports, soybeans, pork, cotton, increasingly uncompetitive in the Chinese market since 2018. The asymmetry is not accidental. It is the point. Here is where the historical pattern becomes unmistakable. In October 1970, 14 months before Henry Kissinger's secret flight to Beijing and 21 months before Richard Nixon landed at the Capitol Airport, Canada established full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. Pierre Trudeau's government made a calculated choice to move ahead of Washington at a moment when the Sino-American relationship was still defined by Cold War hostility. The Canadian move created economic and diplomatic space that Ottawa would quietly exploit for the next 5 decades. The historian John English, writing in his authoritative biography of Trudeau, published by Knopf Canada in 2006, noted that the 1970 recognition was driven by the same logic as the 2025 framework. When Washington's ideological commitments foreclose an economic relationship, Ottawa can sometimes walk through the door. Washington has left closed. What is different in 2025 is the stakes. In 1970, the Canada-China relationship was a diplomatic footnote. Canada's economy was overwhelmingly oriented toward the United States, and nothing Pierre Trudeau signed in Beijing threatened that. In 2025, what Mark Carney is accepting is not a footnote. It is an alternative architecture, a structured pathway that, if expanded over 5 years, could reorient a meaningful share of Canadian mineral and agricultural export flow away from the continental market and toward the Pacific. That is a different order of decision. And the people in Washington understand it. Gordon Holden spent 23 years as a Canadian diplomat in China before becoming the founding director of the University of Alberta's China Institute. He is one of the 3 or 4 people in the country who has actually read the framework documents rather than the press releases. Speaking to the Globe and Mail in April 2025, Holden said something that deserves to be quoted at length because it cuts through the noise. What Beijing has done here is surgically precise. They are not offering Canada a relationship. They are offering Canada a pressure valve. The offer is calibrated to be attractive enough that Ottawa cannot easily refuse it, and specific enough that Washington cannot easily retaliate against it without looking like it is punishing Canada for exercising sovereign economic judgment. The Chinese read the CUSMA renegotiation transcripts. They read the Section 232 steel and aluminum proceedings. They know exactly where the Canadian pressure points are. This is not an act of friendship. It is an act of strategic geometry. That phrase, strategic geometry, is the right frame for what follows. The American response to Carney's acceptance has been more measured than the Canadian press expected. There has been no formal diplomatic protest. There has been no invocation of CUSMA provisions. What there has been is a pattern of quiet signals, a State Department background briefing that described the Canadian framework as inconsistent with Allied coordination on China exposure, a Pentagon review of information sharing protocols with Canada that has not been publicly announced, but has been reported by Politico, and a series of phone calls between the U.S. Trade Representative's office and its Canadian counterparts that have produced, by all accounts, more heat than light. The restraint is itself a signal. Washington is calculating. It does not want to be seen publicly pressuring a democratically elected Canadian government away from a sovereign economic decision. It also does not want to set a precedent that allies can independently negotiate with Beijing on sensitive economic sectors without consequence. The tension between those two imperatives is where the story currently lives. Here is the dimension most coverage missed. The restraint is also a reflection of American uncertainty about whether the continental relationship it assumed was fixed has actually been shaken. The United States has spent the better part of 4 years creating friction with Canada on steel, on softwood lumber, on dairy, on the review provisions that threatened Canadian mineral exports. It created the conditions. It cannot now be entirely surprised by the result. The markets answered within 72 hours of the framework's public announcement. The Canadian dollar strengthened 1.4% against the US dollar in the session following the announcement. Modest by ordinary standards, but notable given the baseline anxiety that had characterized Canadian dollar trading throughout the tariff uncertainty of late 2024 and early 2025. More telling was what happened in the junior mining sector. The TSX Venture Exchange, which functions as the primary capital market for Canadian exploration and early-stage mining companies, rose 2% in the week following the announcement. Companies holding lithium and cobalt properties in the Northwest Territories and Northern Ontario added market capitalization that analysts at RBC Capital Markets described in a note published on April 18, 2025, as pricing in a meaningful probability that Chinese volume commitments will lower the cost of capital for Canadian critical minerals development. That sentence from a Royal Bank research note is worth pausing on. The cost of capital for Canadian mining is going down because Beijing made a commitment. The investment community is treating the Chinese framework as a credible signal. That is a data point about who holds structural leverage in the current moment, and it is not who held it in 2019. Wendy Cutler served as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative under Presidents Obama and briefly under Trump before joining the Asia Society Policy Institute, where she has spent the past several years analyzing how China deploys economic statecraft against allied relationships. She testified before the Senate Finance Committee in March 2025, 6 weeks before Carney's announcement, but in terms that now read as almost precisely predictive. Her testimony deserves to be quoted at length. China's strategic use of market access as an instrument of allied fracture is not new, but it has become more sophisticated. The pattern across the past 18 months has been consistent. Identify an American ally that is experiencing economic friction with Washington. Offer that ally a specific and bounded economic benefit that cannot be easily dismissed as ideological. And then observe whether the ally's institutional loyalty to the Western framework is stronger than its immediate economic interest. The Canadians are not unique in facing this test. The Germans faced it on Nord Stream. The Australians faced it on iron ore. The South Koreans face it on semiconductors. What is different about the Canadian case is the timing and the sector. Critical minerals are the strategic resource of the next 30 years. Beijing is not offering Canada a trade deal. It is offering Canada a choice about which economic order it wants to depend on. That is the verdict from someone with 20 years of direct experience watching how these decisions play out. What Carney accepted is a choice about dependency. The question, and it is not settled, is whether it is a choice that can be reversed once made, or one that sets a path from which the logic of sunk costs and supply chain integration makes deviation progressively more difficult. If you hold savings tied to the Canadian or American economy, and if you are watching this, the probability is that you do. Here is what this moment means in terms you can feel directly. The critical minerals sector is not abstract. It is the supply chain for every electric vehicle battery, every smartphone, every defense system that will be manufactured in the next 30 years. The country that controls the processing and export pathway for those minerals has leverage over industrial economies in the way that Saudi Arabia had leverage over industrial economies after 1973. Canada holds a significant share of the raw material base. What it does with that base, whether it routes it through continental integration with the United States or through Pacific-facing frameworks with China, determines the industrial geography of the mid-21st century. For the Canadian viewer, this is a moment that will determine what kind of country your grandchildren's Canada is. A deeply integrated component of North American industrial order, or a sovereign commodity power with multiple customers and genuine strategic options. Both are defensible choices. They are not the same choice for the American viewer. This is a data point about the cost of treating an ally's economic interests as subordinate to your own political convenience. The leverage that Beijing is now exercising was created in part in Washington. And for anyone holding equities or fixed income in sectors exposed to critical minerals supply chains, the repricing that the TSX Venture Exchange began in April 2025 is not irrational. It reflects the beginning of a real reorientation, not a press release. Mark Carney accepted the Chinese offer. The framework was signed in April 2025. The volume floors are now in effect for the first category, critical minerals, with agricultural and LNG provisions scheduled to activate by year-end, subject to regulatory review. And the communique that arrived in Ottawa with unusual speed now sits in the record. Its language is careful and its commitments are specific, and its implications are, as Gordon Holden said, surgically precise. Pierre Trudeau walked through a door in 1970 that Washington had left closed. His son spent 9 years as Prime Minister navigating the consequences of that original decision, the relationship that China represented, and the relationship with Washington that it complicated. Now, a third Canadian leader has made a choice in that same tradition. At a moment when the stakes are considerably higher, the question is not whether Canada had the sovereign right to accept. It did. The question is whether the architecture being accepted, Chinese volume floors for Canadian minerals, across a 5-year horizon, with integration deepening along the supply chain as each year passes, is the kind of architecture that can be walked back when the political weather changes. Or whether 5 years from now, a future Canadian Prime Minister will look at the cost of unwinding those supply chain relationships and decide that the door, having been walked through, no longer opens easily in the other direction.